have spent years talking about medieval myths on this channel, and for all my yapping, there is one thing I pointedly haven't addressed yet. There's this idea that the Middle Ages were a particularly barbaric, brutal era for torture and imprisonment and carceral punishment, severe over all other eras due to the ridiculousness and creativity of their various torture devices. Popular imaginings picture gleeful, dark-hooded figures shoving prisoners into iron maidens, rending them limb from limb on the rack, etc. Thus, you end up with places like this, the Medieval Torture Museum in the Loop in Chicago, as well as other locations. I believe this place is a new addition to the block right next to the Chicago Theater. I mean, it certainly wasn't there when I lived in the SAIC dorms across the street 11 years ago. Otherwise, I definitely would have visited. But I've been meaning to visit this place for a while, see what is popularly claimed to be authentic medieval torture devices and methods, and figure out, are these things really true? And if not, where do they actually come from? Come learn with me. Really quick sidebar here. In lieu of an actual specific channel charity this month, I really want to ask you guys to donate to your local food bank or do some other volunteer work, because SNAP benefits and food stamps for American recipients are not going to be given out next month, leaving about 40 million Americans in a very food insecure situation, more so than they already were. It was entirely preventable and still is, and yet here we are. So I really want to encourage you to look into what your local situation is, what sort of food banks are near you that might need volunteers or donations. Donate things like socks, nutrient-dense foods, shelf-stable foods. Ask them directly what they need, because sometimes they have an overabundance of certain things. Make a donation. Anything you can do to help your local community on the ground. It's just going to be really hard for a lot of people, and they really could use the help. We all need to come together for each other when our government fails us, and this is one of those opportunities. So join me in doing what you can, and let's be there for each other. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I know you're all so shocked, but yet again, a lot of what we believe about medieval torture comes from, guess who? The Victorians again. Well, and the Georgians. They're both pretty violent defenders. The problem is a great deal of medieval torture devices that we're familiar with are really artistic and elaborate 19th century inventions, or artifacts from entirely non-medieval eras. And I gotta come clean here. I am not free of sin. In my last Wild Crimes in Medieval Times video, I think I didn't make it clear enough that the Scold's Bridle is an early modern device, not necessarily a medieval one. I threw it in there as an addition to the larger topic, because I thought it was relevant, but I should have been more clear about that. I think it confused some people. So my bad, I'm sorry. And this is kind of a historically persistent issue. Like, if you go through books from the 20s or so, you get a few instances of authors mentioning non-medieval torture devices or tactics as medieval artifacts when they aren't. At least this one 1895 Cosmo article correctly concedes that the actual worst instances of medieval torture were done during the Inquisition in the name of holy wars, but even that is more complicated, and we'll get into that in a minute. But then it goes on to claim that torture was born from medieval lawlessness, perpetuated by vigilante secret societies. Then it claims that one method of torture was the victim being, quote, furnished with a roomy pair of boots, into which boiling water was poured, and often when the boots were removed, nothing but bare bones were left behind. So no, that's not physically possible. One of my favorite books that gives insight into why we understand medieval history the way we do is Inventing the Middle Ages by Norman Cantor, plus other authors. He writes in chapter 1, everyone carries around a highly personal view of the Middle Ages. For most people, this is extremely vague or grossly simple and dogmatically crude, although not thereby to be held in contempt. Most people's idea of the Middle Ages, gained from dim recollections of what they were taught in school or saw in a film like Ivanhoe, is of an intellectually very low voltage variety. In writing and reading history, we are visibly creating a psychoanalysis in which our own anxieties, hopes, loves, fears, and disappointments become interactive with the learned discoveries and databases that academic research proliferates. Cantor is pretty brutal regarding Victorian and earlier writings on the Middle Ages. He calls them, quote, a phantasmagoric screen of now obsolete Victorian assumptions that shaped perceptions of the past that are too remote from the modern understanding to be worth bothering about. Oof. But even so, we can't exactly lay all the blame on the Victorians, first of all. A good number of torture myths started with the writings from the era just following the Middle Ages. In fact, a lot of our most persistent ones come from a list devised by the lawyer and doctor Hippolytus de Marcellus, who wrote a bunch of treatises in the 15th to 16th century. This guy was the first one to describe what we now call Chinese water torture, where a victim is driven to madness by the slow and regular dripping of water on one point of their body. He noted this as a possible means of torture when he observed how dripping water erodes stone, but it wasn't actually called Chinese water torture until the 19th century and later popularized by magician Harry Houdini. We have no record at all of this method being used in China or anywhere in Asia for that matter. He's also the source for the idea of sleep deprivation torture. And he's not the only one who published previously unheard of torture methods that were later taken at face value. In 1405, Conrad Kaiser published a codex, Bellefortis, that details numerous made-up and comedic torture devices, including the earliest known illustration of a chastity belt. I won't get too into the chastity belt today, as I'm making a dedicated video on that one, but this codex is obviously not meant to be taken seriously because it also describes invisibility devices and has a bunch of fart jokes. And yet, it helped to launch the chastity belt into the permanent lexicon of torture devices, probably because its ridiculousness is enticing to later generations who firmly believe that everyone in the Middle Ages was a grade A freak. I mean, that's really the crux of this issue. Like, what do you mean people in the Middle Ages were making satire, parodies, and jokes? What do you mean people in the Middle Ages had a sense of humor? What do you mean a random lawyer's musings about how we might torture people isn't an actual description of regular medieval carceral punishment? The medieval era, a time span of, may I remind you, over 1,000 years, covering a huge variety of customs, laws, and regions. I've talked about this at length, but the 1700s to mid-1900s had a thing about running wild with medieval myths and completely making stuff up to pass off as truth, partly in order to reinforce the idea of linear progress, and also to make money. We, in whatever current era we're in, must be the most socially advanced, and therefore, everyone who came before us must have been stupid and barbaric. This mindset obviously attracts scammers looking to make a quick buck off of an eager population ready to believe just about anything about the Dark Ages, no matter how bonkers it is. And I'm not saying that these guys are scammers, but this type of thing is still around today. Hence, the Medieval Torture Museum, which we'll get into in a minute. This museum isn't unique at all, by the way. I remember my first visit to London in 2012 when my parents took us to the now defunct Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Piccadilly Circus. I was a dumb 16-year-old with a humiliating self-induced haircut, so I wasn't yet aware that the emphasis should have been on the not part, and I saw that huge-ass chastity belt and I was like, ah, that's crazy. I mean, it's in a museum. Why would museum lie to me? This mindset really got the Victorians when these artifacts were coming out, too. Easy enough work for some guy with metalworking skills and a little bit of creativity to make up some wacko torture device, and then you have your buddy who works for a publisher write about how it was owned by like 12th century Duke Dick and Balls to get a confession out of prisoners. You sell the thing to a curiosities collector, bing bang boom, easy money. And now the collector has it in his collection that might also have some authentic things in it. Collection gets passed down, written about, donated to a museum, included in books and films, and then what do you know, the Gimbelsburg slab of kidney explosion or whatever is now a widely accepted tool of medieval torture. Serious case in point, the ever-ubiquitous Iron Maiden. This is probably the most famous example of a medieval torture device. It's an iron cabinet in the shape of a woman with hinge doors lined on the inside with spikes that would pierce the victim who was locked inside. But the Iron Maiden, of course, was a fake. Its first mention doesn't appear until the late 18th century when a lawyer and philosopher named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote a fantastical history of it in a booklet for tourists to Nuremberg, Germany. These fictitious local tales and guidebooks were really common at the time, especially morbid ones and horror stories. Allegedly, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was first displayed in the early 19th century with a completely unknown provenance. of course. And then she was acquired by an eccentric man named Charles Chatwin Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. In the 1890s, amidst personal scandal, which was crazy and a long story, he became obsessed with collecting torture devices and other macabre artifacts. By the time he bought the Iron Maiden, it was already starting to become a little apparent that it was a fake. It was actually likely created in the 1860s, and was widely accepted as a myth by the 1920s, although its shocking nature allowed its mythos to persist, especially following its adoption as the namesake of the band Iron Maiden. It was even put on display during the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Another famous one is the Pear of Anguish, a strange pear-shaped metal device that apparently was either inserted into a prisoner's mouth or other orifice, and then cranked open. It's hard to say where the origin of this thing actually is. Most existing ones that get sold by curiosity dealers are obviously modern, even many that are held in supposedly trustworthy museums. Some of them are way too elegantly made to be an actual torture device, unless by like some sadistic weirdo nobleman or something, I don't know. Not to mention their actual coiled spring mechanisms weren't used until post-medieval eras, and the springs on these pears of anguish are far too delicate to be strong enough to actually incite any torturous benefit. It's a clear case of, we don't know what this object is, but it looks crazy, so it must have been a torture device kind of thing, or just completely made up. A similar device is described being used in the story of a thief named Paglioli in the 1600s, but it's clearly different than the pear of anguish we have in, for example, the Louvre. And the mentions of the pear in the story, drifting back to the Middle Ages, doesn't happen until the story gets some mid-Victorian reprints. And of course, a supposed pear of anguish was then collected by the Earl of Shrewsbury in his big old torture collection. I mean, it's not hard to imagine the pear as a torture instrument. It looks a lot like a speculum, and anyone who's had a pap smear knows that definitely could be torturous. But as for the pear itself, the odds are high that it's simply a fake, made to cash in on the Victorian medieval torture device craze, taking over the world of Curiosities collection. The actual punishments of the Middle Ages, especially the ones in common law, were not nearly as creative as they're thought to be. They were very, very basic, and honestly, a bit boring. Madeline H. Calvinus writes in Giving the Middle Ages a Bad Name, "It is clear that the depiction of the violent corporal and capital punishments in the 14th century German law books does not necessarily support the popular view that such scenes were common and ubiquitous spectacles in real life. Yet, ironically, because documentary evidence of the normal kind is lacking, legal historians have turned to these scenes as documents, insisting that they represent real practices, even when those practices are regarded as symbolic rituals." It's like, yeah, these extreme cases are detailed in these illustrations, but that doesn't mean that it was always how it was done, nor that it was even common, or ever happened at all. It's like if in the future, for some reason, the only surviving videos were like of people doing parkour, and then future generations are like, oh my god, people in the early 21st century exclusively traveled by jumping around all over the place. Whoa! Like, no, most of us walk, I think. Or like if future people read references to jokes about fanfics where characters are being sold to one direction and they're like, holy shit, that's crazy. I can't believe 21st century boy bands were buying people. Resting on these assumptions about ubiquitous violence in medieval life leads to all sorts of explanations that, as a result, willingly misrepresent what people were like. Johann Huizinga's 1919 book, The Waning of the Middle Ages, describes the medieval populace as having, quote, a high degree of irritability and excitable souls who were never sated by any extreme torture they witnessed, always craving more, which is how we get the Medieval Torture Museum. Immediately upon entering the museum, I knew this was going to be good, because the stairs are flanked by spooky candles and a rack of chastity belts, and the museum includes a ghost hunting tour option, which really brings up way more questions than it should. Why the fuck is this cramped space that's shoved in next to the Chicago Theater haunted? Even the Chicago Theater isn't really known for being haunted. That honor belongs to the alleyway across the street and the Nederlander Theater behind it, formerly known as the Oriental Theater, which was the scene of a deadly fire back in the day. When I was in my freshman year of college living in the dorms right there, I can't necessarily say we were haunted, but we did keep finding mysterious bras in our dorm that belonged to none of us, and we all certainly weren't getting any bitches, so that wasn't the culprit. One of my roommates was asleep for like 18 hours a day, the other one was a Black Butler fan, and I was staying up till 3 a.m. on a regular basis, writing really bad melodramatic gay novels. So obviously our conclusion was that it was a ghost bra, and we took the train up to a Witchcraft store to ask for help, and they gave us a purifying room spray, and after that we didn't find any more ghost bras, so I guess it worked. Anyway, all this to say, I don't know why the Medieval Torture Museum wants to pretend that the place is haunted, or even that its artifacts are haunted, because none of them have ever been actually used for torture, okay? Almost every single one in there is either a Victorian humbug hoax, a replica, or a benign object incorrectly assumed to be a torture device, or, in the case of this witch scale, a completely made-up thing purely for photo ops. Witch! Oh wait, no. Goblin! None of the information plaques say where the item came from, how old it is, or anything. The walls are covered with random illustrations depicting the torture performed with these devices, but none of them say where the illustration comes from. Many are blatantly post-medieval, even Victorian. Even more are straight-up modern drawings. Of course, me and my college roommate Claire, who was in town for a visit, had a lot of fun in there, mostly because of how ridiculous it was. Mind you, Claire was neither of the roommates aforementioned, she was a later roommate. Anyway, we enjoyed it though because I already kind of knew what I was looking at and expected it to be a funny haha spectacle rather than an educational experience. That's sort of the issue though. Anyone can call themselves a museum when it's really a cabinet of curiosities, and the word museum implies some sort of educational integrity or the opportunity of learning. All right, there's no way that this isn't like a Spirit Halloween store. Mask, right? Come on. At places like the Medieval Torture Museum, you're certainly learning something, but the lack of honest context makes it impossible to say that you're learning any actual history. And it kind of sucks because, I mean, you could. These places could be a palace of debunking myths, but that doesn't make as much money, does it? That's why half of these torture artifacts exist in the first place. The average visitor doesn't want to learn why they're wrong about something, they want to reinforce preconceived notions about an era that they already assume is like this. The morbid curiosity people have makes us want to see more gory, more grotesque examples of how brutal and cruel the past was. And this isn't even necessarily a bad thing in every context. After all, in many situations, the past was much, much more gory and cruel than we were led to believe. Our educational system here in the US increasingly downplays the horrors that we committed against enslaved people and the indigenous population, for example. And while museums across the board have made great strides in recent years to fix that and tell these painful histories and be honest, the current administration has gone out of its way to punish museums who try to show that history, trying to cover it up again. Because that's a history that doesn't make us, and by us I mean white Americans, feel better about ourselves. It hurts. It wounds people's pride. The Middle Ages is so far removed from us, especially here in the US, that its foreignness makes it an easy stomping ground for creating a circus of myths that make medieval people seem inhuman, to make us feel more enlightened. Never mind how much actual cruel torture is being committed today by various governments and militaries. We are, at this very moment, far, far worse than any medieval torture could have hoped to be. Ah, but hey, that's no fun. Look at this huge barrel. I love huge barrel. So if medieval torture devices are usually bogus, then what was actually going on? Is there any truth to it at all? Well, yes and no. I think it's easy to look at history and mistake the most severe punishments for common practice. It's hard not to generalize history when abridging it. But punishment varied widely through the medieval era, depending on region and what the crime actually was. More often than not, a punishment for the average crime was typically something like public humiliation or paying a hefty fine. In some centuries, even murder was atoned for by paying a fine to the victim's family, and in some cases, a rather extreme punishment is described in law codexes, but we have no evidence of said punishment actually being carried out at all, as opposed to something more tame. In her book, Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, Danielle Cybulski writes, "It's important to remember that unlike today's trials in which it's normal to not know the defendant or any of the other people in the courtroom, the people who were on all sides of a medieval case, defense, prosecution, jury, and sometimes judge, were usually neighbors. It's human nature to extend the benefit of the doubt towards people you know and to treat them with lenience." She also brings up the very good point that in an extremely religious society that the Middle Ages was, people were very serious about the commandments, including thou shalt not kill. Just because this guy killed somebody doesn't now make it okay for you to kill too, even in the name of justice. More often, a serious criminal was instead exiled from the community after some other punishment. Even some capital punishments need to be viewed from a medieval mindset. For instance, a heretic being burned at the stake was not being burned with the idea of suffering as the goal, but rather using fire as a purification. Think of why hell has hellfire, it's to purify people's souls. After the onlookers add things to the fire to cause more smoke, allowing the less painful death by smoke inhalation before the flames even creep up. And even these cases were far less common than the less flashy ones, like the pillory or even hanging. The exception often being the crime of treason, in particular after the passing of the Great Statute of Treasons of 1351, which more often than not did incur a severe and dramatic punishment, such as sometimes being drawn and quartered, disemboweled, burned alive, strangled, or castrated. That said, cases of capital punishment are not really the same situation as the idea of medieval torture as a general punishment for a variety of crimes not warranting death, nor was there an excessively common framework in which capital punishment was frequently preceded by drawn-out, creative, brutal torture using weird and artistic contraptions. You don't actually start seeing torture be used in the modern sense, often to get information or a confession out of someone, until the post-medieval eras, around the Enlightenment period, ironically. Some medieval legal texts depict violent torture, but were actually intended to shock officials into rethinking severe punishments, lest their own souls be condemned for cruelty. Other manuscripts depict blood punishment in a more symbolic way, which is pretty in line with medieval art trends at large. Much of it is not meant to be taken literally or viewed as a depiction of common life. Madeline Calvinist continues, "Although the Middle Ages, invented in the colonial period, was notorious for cruel punishments and torture, the dramatic visual depictions of such actions occur far more often in sacred Christian contexts than in legal manuscripts. On first sight, it's even possible to confuse some representations of the torture and martyrdom of Christ or the saints who imitated his passion. A subtext in these pious images is the Christian doctrine of purification and atonement by suffering." Again, that's not to say that very severe and creative torture didn't happen. It was just most notable during the Inquisition, often listed in the Knights Templar trial records. As I mentioned in my video on gay knights, there were numerous cases where confessions of sodomy in the French Knights Orders were acquired via torture, often through the wheel or the rack, or with letting fire be put against their feet. Wars, especially holy wars, are always apt to turn people into monsters. But even in the case of the Inquisition, it wasn't as widespread and extreme as we've been led to believe. Post-medieval writings and artworks about the Inquisition have dramatized it in misleading ways, depicting the pre-Enlightenment European landscape as a cataclysmic wasteland of sadism. But given the centrality of religion here, it's a holy war after all, the anxiety over salvation was ever present, and most people were terrified that excess brutality would result in their eternal damnation. It's something that many of today's so-called faithful would probably do well to remember. Jody Enders writes, "In the medieval theater of cruelty, what is at stake is the demystification of both the aesthetics of violence and the critical response to it. In the case of torture, the critical tendency to condemn, to over-explain, or to excuse might ultimately derive less from a true sensitivity to the Middle Ages than from the false notion of our own moral superiority. It's difficult not to accept Page Dubois' succinct refutation of Foucault's claim that we are now far away from the country of tortures, dotted with wheels, gibbets, gallows, and pillories. Eloquently debunking the myth of alienation, she offers a simple rejoinder. Tell it to the El Salvadorans. We have to be careful about how we speak about the past. More often than not, and sometimes subconsciously, it allows us to ignore responsibility for current atrocities. If the past is always worse, surely our present is justified. The sooner we understand how wrong that is, the sooner we can come to terms with it. Medieval torture devices, the fantastical ones, more often than not are simply a reflection of a more modern society that wants to fool itself into believing that we're much better than they were. But at the same time, sure, it's a little funny. And you gotta hand it to them, the inventors of these hoax artifacts were certainly creative. Thank you for learning with me about medieval torture. I hope it wasn't too much of a bummer, but alas. Have any of you ever visited one of the many medieval torture museums? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to grab yourself a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated: The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun. And until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't lose the keys to the pillory.